Okay. Last class, very sad. I know, you're sad about this as well. Um, but all good things must come to an end, right? Okay, let's look at the weekly questions. I want to talk to you a little bit about the weekly questions and what I'm seeing that I wish I weren't seeing and what I'm seeing that's pretty good. So, stuff I wish I weren't seeing. Let's see. On question number 1 about Reagan, the question is to analyze Reagan administration in domestic and foreign policy and why he was still popular. What I'm noticing is that people are doing a really good job on domestic policy stuff that happens at home within the country, mostly talking about taxes. Um, when you talk about tax cuts, maybe mention that it's income taxes that were cut. Some of you are saying like you cut taxes, but not which ones. Not the biggest deal in the world, I promise. But fewer people are talking about foreign policy, so the stuff that happens overseas, folks zero noise about to happen. So fewer people are discussing foreign policy, and a lot of people aren't even talking about the third part of the question, which is why Reagan was still popular when he left, even though the deficit was really big. So don't forget to talk about that part of the question, okay? That's the biggest mistake I'm seeing on question number 1, okay? Question number 2. I don't know, there's some weird stuff going on with question number 2. And the consistently weird thing that I'm seeing is you're either talking about stuff that happened a really long time ago, like 1890s, or you're talking about stuff that happened after the Bush administration. Now, I'm okay with the 1890 stuff, it's okay, but don't make that the only thing you talk about. There are some people that went all the way back to the Revolutionary War. I mean, if you've already started and you've done that, I'm not saying change it. I'm just saying if you haven't started, there's no need to go back that far. You can go back, you don't have to go back that far. What I'd really like to see in question number 2 is some modern era stuff. So World War II or later stuff about our foreign policy. Are we protecting and defending, or are we possessing and conquering? Now, it is okay to compare the stuff that we did before the Bush administration to the stuff that we do during the Bush administration. But if all you talk about is the stuff in the Bush administration, he's not talking about his own administration in 2001 because he hasn't had it yet. So when he's making that statement, he's not talking about Iraq and Afghanistan and 9/11 because none of those things have happened yet. Yeah, because I had one paper, it's like, Bush is a liar and all we were trying to do was take over these countries and there was no evidence. Like, that's not bad. I'm not saying that you can't discuss that. I'm saying if that's the only thing you're discussing, you're not going to get all the points. So some stuff before the Bush administration would be good, especially stuff post World War II. I'd love to see a thing or two in there, but I'm not expecting you to trace everything back to the Revolutionary War. And I'm also not expecting 15 examples. 2 or 3 would be nice. 15, it's a lot, isn't it? And remember, when there's a agree or disagree question, usually you want to acknowledge that the other side isn't ridiculous. So, at least mention like, well, there were times such as in, this instance where we were doing this, more often we did that. Also, somebody was really upset and thought it was imperialism because we bought Alaska. And I thought, well, that's an interesting thought. Interesting thought. I don't know. Because I never thought about buying Alaska as imperialism. I thought it was just a purchase. But I suppose not, nothing's ever just a purchase, is it? Yeah, because I know I would not think of the Louisiana purchase quite that way, because I would kind of combine that with some other stuff and Native American removal, that kind of thing. Sorry that I keep dropping things. I'm going to drop some more stuff. But yeah, if you talk about Alaska, that's fine too, but I would love to see some 20th century stuff in there. And the problem with the third answer that I'm seeing a lot is what I've highlighted, presidential campaigns. Mostly what I'm seeing is people talking about what Obama does during his presidency and what Trump does during his presidency. And we're really talking about their campaigns. Now, it's fine for you to talk about what they do in the presidency, However, if you don't talk about the campaigns, you're not really answering the question. So make sure you talk about their use of technology, because they both use technology really well to attract voters, to campaign, and to raise money. Trump is particularly good at using television media without having to pay for it. He gets a lot of interviews, he makes the news a lot, and that's part of his goal. I would also mention who they appeal to. You know, they appeal to people who want change, and then mention the types of change that maybe they're pushing for. You're doing a better job on that. But don't forget about their use of technology to attract new voters, different voters, and how they tend to attract voters who want change. Okay. All right. You guys have any questions about the weekly question? Sorry. There's somebody who came in kind of recently, and when they started to come in, it said iPhone 2. I thought maybe I'd figure out who that was. Some of you are going like, yeah, I got an iPhone. I think it's Sophia. That's who I'm going to say it is. But then I'll double check the roll toward the end. Okay. Let's look at the notes, and then maybe I'll sneeze again. We'll see. Or cough. I didn't really sneeze yet. Although it could happen. All of this because I raked leaves. I'm so allergic to stuff. I'm doing something wrong. Hang on one sec. I'm trying to share the notes with you, but apparently I still have the weekly questions. Do I still have the weekly questions up? Am I still confused about technology on the next to last day of class? I am. Okay. There we go. All right. I did not add too many notes, but I did add some notes and I reposted those. Excuse me for doing this in front of you. I did repost some notes. And I just added this to the end of the Unit 4 lecture notes. So I am so sorry, but it had to happen. Oh, gosh. Oh. Okay. All right. So we had already talked about the random stuff that happened. So I think our starting point here is economic and political movements during this era. So I listed them in the order they're listed in the book. Excuse me. So apologies not being exactly chronological, although relatively close. So you saw some movements during this era that are kind of organic, so they rise up from the people. And people are frustrated about many things in the modern era. You live in the modern era. We're all upset about something, it seems. But we don't all start movements, although there are a bunch of movements that have been started in our recent political past, and economic movements as well. So Occupy Wall Street's kind of a combo of a political and economic movement. And some people think it kind of morphed into Antifa, or that some Antifa parts grew out of that. But this is generally a frustration, a movement that comes out of the frustration of young people about rising economic, socioeconomic, mostly economic inequality. Really kind of happens in the middle of toward the end of recession. And it's really those college graduate age folks, you know, in part because they graduated and couldn't find jobs. That's not the only thing, of course. But, you know, when you're told, and I know your generation has been told, if you go to college, get a degree, you're set, you know, everything's going to be great for you. So you'll get out of college, you'll get like 5 job offers and everything will be perfect. Well, you know, that's not exactly how it works. Or if you don't know that, that's not exactly how it works. So, you know, you might get some job offers, but they might be in places you don't want to live. You might not get any job offers in, you know, whatever it is you studied. It's tricky. But the economy was slow. What people noticed, especially the young folks, is like, well, the economy's crap for me, but for those people who own businesses, large companies especially, it's going really well. I don't think anybody ever really gets mad at small business owners. I don't think that's the thing. but it's usually people who own corporations. And what you would notice if you looked at the stats from this era, and Dr. Frona will help you do that if you like, is that corporate profits continued to rise during this era, and CEO, corporate executive salaries rise very quickly, much faster than the income of people who work in those corporations. So, excuse me, sorry. So what we talked about in the 50s and 60s, where when the economy expanded, you saw the advantages of that expansion in pretty equally in both poor, middle class, and upper income groups. That's not the case in the modern era. The gains for the upper income groups for corporate wealth are much larger than those for middle class and lower, and below. So that's a source of frustration, and people will go and have sit-ins or sit-down strikes near Wall Street and then in economic areas in cities on the West Coast, primarily Seattle and Portland, because there are some headquarters for some very large corporations there as well. And these folks maybe vandalized things, they tagged things a little bit, spray painted, but I mean, they did other stuff as well. And some of these protests were more symbolic, while others, maybe involve some vandalism or theft, that sort of thing as well. So kind of a combination of a peaceful sit-in kind of movement, demonstration, with something a little more, I don't know what the right word is. Assertive's not really the right word, but intense. We'll just go with that. All right, and maybe the extension of this in the modern era is Antifa, although those folks usually are breaking stuff and tearing things up, because it's kind of the nature of being anarchist, and those folks I think are as much economic anarchists as they are political anarchists. And it's not a well-organized group, but that's again the nature of being anarchist. Okay, so we have protests against economic inequality and economic frustration for people who thought maybe they were going to get ahead because of the way that they've prepared and haven't seen that success as quickly as they hoped or ever. Black Lives Matter starts officially in 2014 as a reaction to several public use of excessive force incidents by police, most notably in Ferguson and in New York City, but also in Florida and lots of other places as well. And, if you look at instances of police excessive force, you notice it's a very small percentage of police interactions. If you look at the percentage of the excessive force complaints that are toward people of color, you'll notice it's a very large percentage of the interactions. So, you always hear people, I don't know, we're good at arguing our own point and against someone else's point rather than, seeing the full picture. I think most people can agree generally the police are okay or good. When they're not, the problem is if you make a mistake as a police officer, it can easily cost someone their life. And you can't fix that once you've made that mistake. So why not very many people want to be police officers? Because, it's a high stress, difficult job. Also, one of the things that gets pointed out during that era, continuing in this era, is that police officers don't get all the training that they need to perform their jobs effectively. So you've seen a push for things like body cameras, which I know isn't training, but might help show some of the situation that's going on, so you don't have to listen to all, I mean, you do have to listen to the different perspectives, but perhaps the camera gives a new perspective on what happened. And also a push for more mental health training and more education for police officers so that they have tools to handle difficult situations in less lethal, with using less lethal force. And I have friends, relatives who police officers, and of course they'll always say that the calls they hate going to the most are domestic disturbance calls, because everybody's angry at that point and most people are violent. So it's really hard to de-escalate situations like that. So training about how to de-escalate situations and, yeah, not use force. And this, of course, is a complaint that you see continue through this day. And it seems like everybody picks one side or the other. And, you know, I don't know. For me, you know, because I do like to hang out in the middle politically, I suppose. You know, certainly most police are fine. Some are really good. The ones who are bad can be lethal, and that really is a problem. And you also know, if you live in the area, which I trust that you do, I know my husband did pre-student teaching observations at McNeil High School in Round Rock. And apparently at the front of that school is Travis County, and the back of that school is Williamson County. So whenever anything went down, if somebody was doing something they shouldn't do, if there was a fight, maybe they were using a substance they shouldn't use, the kids really understood that, and they all did that in the front of the school rather than the back of the school. So it's like, you know, we know too that there are different jurisdictions that enforce laws in different ways. That could be the understatement of it. But that has not as much to do, of course, with Black Lives Matter, which really is about racial inequalities in law enforcement and use of excessive force. So Tea Party is a 2010 movement, which is more of a pushback against perceived federal government overreach, and really led to the rise of a more, I don't know that conservative is the right word, but I will go with it because I can't think of a better one, part of the Republican Party that produces, I don't know, in Texas, I think, you know, most of the Republican Party is pretty conservative, but, you know, it produces the reactions that you see in some of the swing states. Maybe, you know, maybe some of the Midwestern and Deep South states, but those portions of really conservative Republicans that you see in places like Pennsylvania or Wisconsin or Ohio or Florida. And I know Texas has conservative Republicans, but I think that's more of what we expect in Texas. But the Tea Party movement leads to the election of a lot of fairly conservative Republicans. And what you see is essentially gridlock in political activity. So you don't see as much compromise. You don't see bills where the parties work together, which is why you always have, like in the old days, they called them the Gang of Eight, or in the modern days, I forget what the name of the group is right now. Sorry, it's so many things to remember, who are working specifically to get the House and Senate to pass a relief bill. But, you know, there are people who are kind of in the middle of their party, and they're in small numbers now. In part because the movements that we're talking about and other things have pushed people who were very active politically more to the edges of their party, to the greater extreme. In 2017, you see a Me Too movement. I think this primarily rises out of women in entertainment industry who feel like without sexual favors, their careers are not going to advance. And they talk specifically about talent agent, I think, Harvey Weinstein, or maybe he's a producer. I think he's a producer. But you start to see a more public discussion of how women in that industry, you know, how it's kind of a poorly kept secret in that industry that sexual favors are required for advancement. And then you get women in other industries talking about either similar things or, you know, their version of those things, which might be more, you know, abusive language or, you know, probably not direct sexual favors required for advancement, although some women would talk about that. But you do start to see women talk more publicly about how they're treated differently in the workplace. So you see a push for that. I know about that time. Something really kind of inappropriate happened to me, which I won't discuss here. And always surprises me because I don't know, I have 3 brothers. You know, I teach history. I just work with a bunch of dudes, as a rule, not so much at the college, but at the high school. And it really wasn't as related to my high school teaching job as it was to the soccer league that I run. It's like, wow, I can't believe people said that out loud. But kind of a reminder that sexism might still exist. All right, might, I don't know. The 2016, let's talk about Trump. Trump, okay. Sorry for the pause there. So Donald Trump, President Trump, the biggest problem I have with President Trump is that he ruined my credibility as a history teacher, and here's how. Still teaching high school in 2016, also community college, but high school was my main gig. And then I had a student say like, hey, Serna, who do you think is going to win the Republican nomination? Because there were like 82 people or 20 running for the nomination. I said, the only thing I know for sure is there's no way it'll be Donald Trump. Trump, you ruined my credibility. But he was a surprise for a variety of reasons. He is definitely a non-traditional anti-establishment candidate. So his background, as you know, is in real estate development and casinos and resorts. He lived primarily in New York City, but kind of a global citizen, traveled quite a bit. He'd also been on a TV show for a really long time, The Apprentice, where he fired people. He, I guess, hired celebrity and business-related apprentices to help him run his business and run certain projects. And then weekly they evaluated the success. But he's a reality TV show star. He's, kind of an early version of that. So he gains notoriety through his business and then popularity through the TV show. And then he runs for office and we go like, is this a stunt? Does he really mean this? And I apparently he really meant it, because there he was getting elected. You definitely want to mention in your weekly question, and the book talks about this a bit, his skillful use of social media. Now, I know, there's still a lot of talk about Facebook and Facebook ads and whether they're Russians, and I'm not really talking about that, although you can mention that if you like. I'm really talking about the use of Twitter. Trump is tweeting all over the place, isn't he? And he's certain. I know President Obama tweeted as well, but not to the extent that Trump does. Plus, we all know Trump doesn't sleep. I don't know how you get to be an old man like that and never sleep. No offense, President Trump, if you're listening. He knows he's old, right? But crud, he sleeps like 3 or 4 hours a night and then tweets, wow, it's amazing. I just wonder how you are as active as he is and you don't sleep. You don't have to answer that. And he's because my students would always say, my high school students, like, sir, he's got to be on drugs. And I go like, no, he's not on drugs. Because one of the things, if you read about him or you listen to him, he talks about his brother who was an alcoholic and died young. So he never drinks. He's a drug-free kind of guy. He's just wound that way. I mean, that's just the way his nature is. But, he's an intense fellow and he uses Twitter a lot. And he doesn't have the same sense of propriety as most politicians have. That's going to be my understatement. And absolutely, Trump was a Democrat. Thanks for mentioning that. To be an effective businessman in New York, I would think you almost have to be. But, when he had voted before, he had always voted for Democrats. He was friends with the Clintons. The Clintons came to his third wedding. I don't know if they went to either the first two. I'm guessing not the first one. But yeah, most of the people he associated with or tried to influence, however you want to look at it, were Democrats. So he's not a traditional Republican, not a traditional politician in any meaningful way. And how he got his message out was very directly. He didn't want to go through the press necessarily. So if you tweet, nobody filters what you say. And that's the way Donald Trump wants his communication to go. Clearly it is. Because of that also, he didn't spend nearly as much money in 2016 as his opponent, who I think outspent him by at least 2 times. And he was clearly successful. So I know in 2016, and not so much in 2020, although I know the jury's kind of still out, but not exactly. So if you're holding out hope, I think most of that will go away in the next few days. I think the Supreme Court's supposed to hear back from some states. If they were supposed to hear back at noon, but I haven't watched the news to see, or I think it's the Supreme Court where Texas filed the case. Sorry, somebody's coming in. And the electors are certified next week. So I think most of that stuff will be officially over with next week. And I've not read anybody who thinks that there's going to be a big change potentially in the election outcome. I don't think most people who follow politics think there will be. But you know, I already told you I was super surprised that Trump got elected. And it's, again, because of the non-traditional anti-establishment kind of thing. All right, so he used a lot of slogans. It's some weird beep. Was that you guys or was that me? I think that was you. Did I say weird? That sounded judgmental. But he certainly was a slogan kind of guy. Make America Great Again. We've heard that. I mean, that's kind of a revamp of a Reagan slogan, which was a revamp of a very traditional idea in American politics, that we need to emphasize the primacy of the United States, America first, that kind of stuff, American exceptionalism, which we'll talk about in a minute. He also talked a lot about building a wall, and at his campaign rallies then and occasionally, you know, now when he goes out and speaks, you still might hear chants of build that wall. And it's a beautiful wall and Mexico will pay for it. And, you know, so he wanted to build a wall. He also, you would hear chants of lock her up anytime he would talk about Hillary Clinton, and the lock her up, oh, somebody's commenting. You know, oh gosh. As far as building the wall, I think I read somewhere that they built 400 miles of the wall during the Trump presidency. So I think there'd been a wall stall during the Obama administration. But I mean, you've read the book and you noticed that we really stepped up immigration enforcement in the Bush and then even more so in the Obama administration. So you saw more deportations in that era. Now you might argue because of that, there weren't as many during this era. Plus Trump seems less immigration friendly, which we'll talk about in a sec as well. So even though the statistics may not bear that out, the rhetoric does. And that's always tricky as well, because it makes, it's just tricky. I guess I don't want to elaborate beyond that because that gets pretty speculative. But the Hillary Clinton issues, as I recall during the campaign, were about the use of a server that was not a government server for email, and then that data being stolen. And so there was discussion about the illegality of that and some other things. And then, of course, the drain the swamp idea, that you want to send in people who are not corrupted because they're career politicians who have different backgrounds, and they can go in and clean up Washington. And that's slightly reminiscent maybe of Jimmy Carter, but certainly not in the same way. Maybe slightly reminiscent, but I can't imagine you can make any other comparison between Trump and Jimmy Carter, because those two are just not the same. We're going to go with that because it's true. That's why we're going with that. All right. I was checking the time. We're still early. We're good. Okay. But I still have a few things to say. We're not done, I promise. Oh, I saw somebody chatting. Let me check. Do I think Biden? Yes. I think Biden will get rid of the immigration ban, and that's kind of where we're headed next, is some immigration stuff. Yeah, Biden has said that one of the first things that he'll do is reverse immigration ban from certain Islamic countries. And, you know, the courts were a little iffy on that anyway, but yeah, Biden said that'll be his first reversal. So the Trump presidency really is part of a global move to insert more aggressive nationalistic leaders throughout the world. And the book gives you a bunch of examples. Let's see if I can remember. To me, like Boris Johnson is pretty obvious in Brexit in England. I don't know if you want to think of Angela Merkel as a new kind of Germany first sort of person. You know, Germany's got that history, so they got to be careful, but they do like her, and she does. I think the EU would suggest that her policies are a little more friendly to her own country than the Union. Certainly, because of soccer, I occasionally have contact with people from Brazil, and they certainly elected their own version of Trump with Bolsonaro, the tropical Trump, as it were. But the book talks about several different countries. They even talk about Putin, but Putin, it works and it doesn't. I mean, it works and it doesn't. But he's old KGB, and he's going to be popular, I think, in the context of making Russia great again, I suppose, because they're kind of longing for those days when the Soviet Union dominated that part of the world, which, as you've probably heard on news and political talk shows lately, when people talk about the impact of Russia, it certainly has an enormous regional impact, but the Russian economy is smaller than the Texas economy or, a few countries in South America. So not saying that it isn't, important, but, and certainly Putin's Putin, dang. And certainly leaders of places like North Korea and China, that they're probably a different story because they're not exactly elected. They kind of stay till they die or somebody knocks them off. So that's a slightly different thing. Okay. Trump withdraws from the U.S. withdraws the United States from the Paris Climate Agreement or Paris Climate Accords. And he's going to say that for a couple of reasons. One, I mean, he pretty openly says he's not sure that he believes in climate change. And two, he doesn't think that those are fair or beneficial to the United States because he thinks the standards are higher for the U.S. Than they are for India and China. And that India and China they get too long to kind of get to the same standard as everybody. So, and there's a good chance President-elect Biden has certainly talked about rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement. So some people are going to list Trump as a climate change denier. Other people are just going to say, no, the problem really is that it's an economic issue. And he's going to say both things publicly because, that's what he does. And definitely issues an executive order to ban immigrants from most Islamic countries. He reverses some of the provisions of DACA, although the courts didn't necessarily support him on that. But DACA is the deferred arrival. So if you're brought over as a child and you're not born in the United States, but you, of course, didn't have any choice whether you emigrated, this gives you an opportunity to apply for American citizenship, to legally go to college and get funding, that sort of thing. And then once you finish college, to be able to get a job and stay in the United States. So the courts weren't very supportive of that either. However, because of a lot of the rhetoric about immigrants, about countries not sending their best people and sending rapists and murderers and criminals, certainly the rhetoric supported the anti-immigrant feeling, whether the statistics, back that up on deportations. They don't, but certainly the ban on immigration from Islamic countries, it kind of backs that up. But the feeling, of course, from the rhetoric has always been in the Trump administration that he is anti-immigrant. I mean, that's the feeling that you get because of the rhetoric. He's also going to push against global internationalism, which is what you saw in the Obama administration. And he referred to that sometimes as leading from behind. So just the idea that, maybe we need to set an example, help where we can, but not push people to do things. And American exceptionalism is more of the Trump idea, make America great again. America's the greatest country that ever existed. Therefore, it needs to be the leader in everything, but maybe not pay for everything. That's going to be another thing that he'll emphasize, that just because we want to tell everybody what to do doesn't mean that we have to pay for it. So in places like NATO, where we're footing most of the bill, and from Trump's assessment, other people are gaining more from that than we are, they need to step up and pay more. And similar thoughts about the UN, although he's not going to argue that the United States gets great benefits from the UN, but we do fund quite a bit of it. And also, when people complain that his demeanor is not very presidential, he's going to say that he is new presidential rather than traditional presidential, and he'll refer to himself as a counter puncher. So if you do something to him, he's not going to have someone else fight back. He's going to do it himself. And he may do it through a tweet. He might do it in an interview. But if you say something bad about him, he's going to say something worse about you. So I think I think he's held true to that promise. I think we've seen that for sure. Now, if you're looking for, I mean, the book doesn't have a conclusion about the Trump administration because, well, I mean, it hasn't concluded yet, and certainly had not when the book was published. However, you know, if you're going to, I think it's always hard to assess a current president because usually we're kind of tied up in our own political views. It's kind of hard to look back at an administration that isn't finished yet and say, like, what were the best things about it and what were the worst. I know what you consistently hear cited, and I think, you know, is true. It's true. It just may not be as beneficial as it seems to everybody. Excuse me, there's a lot of economic growth during the time period. It may or may not have benefited people equally, and we see that all throughout the modern era. So that's not necessarily a new thing, a new phenomenon with Trump, but it's a continued phenomenon. Certainly, he's going to argue that the stock market has reached heights it's never reached before, and that is true. And even in the middle of pandemic and a really tough economic time, the stock market just keeps on going, which is really good if you own stock. So, and some of you are going like, yeah, but nobody owns stock. It's tricky because more people own stock now than ever before. So, you know, economists are going to argue that that's really a big deal. However, most of us don't directly own stock. We own it through maybe a retirement fund that we have. And it does really, I mean, it benefits you in the long run, but not as much as it benefits stock traders and corporate ownership, that sort of stuff. So, you know, in the long run, maybe it benefits people in their retirement accounts. And again, not everybody has those. Sometimes, you know, you just have Social Security and they don't invest in the stock market. I do know what Social Security does. It's my job, right? They spend all the extra money, they put it into the budget. One of the things that I think has to be mentioned about the previous three presidents is they're very good at spending and not good at paying down the deficit. It's funny because we complain historically about the Reagan deficit, but the last three presidents have expanded it exponentially. And I understand why we complain about the Reagan deficit. And I also get the idea that when the economy is bad, you're supposed to spend money to get out of it. It's just when the economy is good again, you're supposed to pay off the debt. And in the modern era, we don't see it quite that way. We really don't, because, you know, bond ratings, credit ratings for the United States government still remain high, and the United States economy is still seen as the most, I mean, by all measures, as the most valuable, except that, as the most valuable in the world. It will be surpassed by China in the next few years, but, you know, currently the U.S. economy is still the most productive. Weird to think about, isn't it? Because we're not the biggest country, but we're good at making stuff and spending money. But Trump sees himself as the new president. As new presidential, he's going to argue back. When you say bad stuff about him, he's going to defend his own record. He's going to remind you what he deserves credit for. And he doesn't have that same idea of, what is the right word, of decorum as previous presidents do. That is not to say, because I know you guys have read enough and know enough about politicians, that behind the scenes, they aren't pretty jerky and they don't sometimes say horrific things. They just don't normally tweet them. So with Trump, I mean, for better or worse, we know what we're getting. You know, he is pretty upfront about how he thinks about things. I do think probably the best thing he'll be remembered for historically, but I'm just guessing and it's still way too early to say this for sure, is the speed with which the vaccine rolled out. And a lot of that is that combined government-private partnership, you know, that we maybe have seen during the Great Depression or during, you know, wars, the world wars before. So that has been an interesting thing. And that's really built on things that started changing about vaccine development and disease research during the Bush administration, the younger Bush administration, and then built upon by the Obama administration, which I think ideally is how our government's supposed to work, where we have a president that looks at a system and says, or his administration says, hey, that doesn't work well for us. What can we do to fix that? And then the next president says, hey, I like what he did there. Let's continue that and improve it. So I think more of that probably happens behind the scenes, and we don't hear about it because that would require the current president to give the previous president credit, which that's hard, you know, even for presidents that have decorum, which our current president would openly say he does not. All right, so that final question about the Trump campaign and the Obama campaign, I really would emphasize more about how they campaigned, how they used technology, who they campaigned to, what pushes for change that they represented. You can talk about policy if you want, but don't forget about technology, okay? All right, that seems to be, I know it was kind of a short class, and at least the 2 or 3 of you is like, why do we even have class? Because we got to talk about Trump a little. All right, do you guys have any questions? And let me double check the roll before you go. So try not to like just slide off really quick, and let me stop the recording because I don't want to announce roll.